The words hit me like a slap across the room, delivered by a man on his first day who hadn't bothered to learn my name before deciding I didn't belong. One moment I was finishing the final steps of a launch 9 years in the making. The next, security was walking me out into a storm like I'd committed a crime. What he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that he'd just pulled the wrong pillar out of the building. If you've ever been underestimated or dismissed at work, tell me in the comments. And if you want to hear how this all unfolds, subscribe for the full story. The moment he pointed at me, the whole floor went silent. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from confusion. It was the sharp, embarrassed kind people make when they see something wrong happening and don't know whether to look away or pretend they didn't hear it. His voice cut through the office like he'd been waiting all morning to use it on someone. Her, she's gone, effective immediately. He didn't blink, didn't hesitate, didn't even bother to ask what I was doing at my desk when he walked up. Jordan Vance, the CEO's 26-year-old son, wearing a suit that could have paid my rent for 2 months, had decided I was his first official act of leadership. I watched him stalk toward me with the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life. The closer he got, the stronger his cologne hit. Sharp, expensive, aggressive, like he'd chosen it specifically to announce his authority before he ever opened his mouth. People turned in their chairs. Someone in marketing gasped. I stood slowly, my hands flat on my desk, still steady even as something hot and humiliating began burning beneath my ribs. "You look like you've been here forever," he said, waving his hand in a lazy circle, like he was shooing a fly. "We're restructuring, starting with dead weight." I told him I'd been with the company 9 years, that I was senior systems architect, that I'd built the foundation of the platform launching in 2 weeks. He laughed, actually laughed. "Yeah, well, we're moving in a younger direction. Fresh energy, no offense." Everything about the moment was offensive, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. He didn't want a conversation. He wanted a spectacle, a display of authority on his first day so everyone would know he could do it. The worst part wasn't even his words. It was the way people around us froze, because they knew I didn't deserve this but couldn't risk saying so. Keller and Santos, the 2 security guards I spoke with every morning, wouldn't even meet my eyes. He told them to escort me out before she causes a scene, as if humiliation were something I'd chosen. They stepped forward awkwardly, apologetic without daring to apologize. I packed the small things first. A mug my sister bought me, a photo of my nieces, a plant that somehow survived 9 years of fluorescent lighting. Not one person came over. Not one person dared to speak. That, more than his arrogance, made the humiliation complete. As they walked me toward the elevators, Jordan's voice floated after us, casual and careless. "Someone younger can pick up whatever she was doing." That was the moment something inside me stilled. Not broke, stilled. Because in that instant, I understood something he didn't. There were parts of my job no one could pick up. Parts no one knew existed yet. Parts he had just thrown out of the building without a second thought, like tossing out a fuse and believing the lights would stay on. The elevator doors closed and the office vanished behind steel. I kept my face calm, but a single undeniable truth had already settled in my chest. The real consequences of what he'd done hadn't begun to show. Not yet. The rain had already soaked through my blazer by the time I reached my car, but the cold didn't bother me nearly as much as the heat of shame still clinging to my skin. Getting fired is one thing. Getting fired in front of an entire floor like you're some outdated furniture they finally had the courage to haul away is something else entirely. When I finally shut the car door, the sudden quiet made the truth hit even harder. They had no idea what they'd just done. Not Jordan, not the executives, not even the new hires who never bothered to learn what I actually did. To them, I was another long-timer, the woman who arrived early, stayed late, kept things running. But what I carried in my head, what lived only in my head, was something none of them had ever asked about. I sat in the driver's seat with my hand still gripping the wheel, letting the storm slide down the windows, and opened my phone out of habit. 32 missed calls, then 37, then a new voicemail, all in the last 20 minutes. None from Jordan, of course. He wasn't calling because he didn't know he needed to. Not yet. They were from the IT director, from the project manager, from legal. Names flashing across the screen like a list of people discovering an unpleasant truth in real time. I shut the phone off and let it drop into the passenger seat. For the first time in years, I drove home without thinking about work, or deadlines, or what needed to be done tomorrow morning. The storm followed me all the way to my apartment, the kind of relentless rain that feels personal. Once inside, the quiet wasn't comforting. It was the kind of quiet that demands you face the whole situation without excuses or distractions. I changed into dry clothes, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my laptop. Not because I wanted to help them, because I needed to understand the fallout they were about to step into. People think systems break because of sabotage or incompetence. Most of the time, systems break because someone removed a person they never bothered to understand. During the rebuild last year, something the old CTO had signed off on, I ended up creating a layered authentication structure that required a final administrator credential to activate. A credential that wasn't written down yet because the official transfer was scheduled for next week. It wasn't meant to be permanent, it wasn't meant to be secret, it was simply unfinished work, the kind that happens naturally when you're building something massive and still patching pieces together. They never asked what stage the build was in. They never asked what still needed to be finalized. They never asked what only I knew. Jordan didn't pause long enough to consider that firing someone mid-project meant firing the only person who understood certain unfinished parts. He assumed knowledge lived in documentation. He assumed everything important was already written down. He assumed the system was complete because it looked complete. Looking complete and being complete are two entirely different things, a truth you learn the hard way only once. I opened my resume file, something I hadn't touched in nearly a decade, and stared at it for a long moment before beginning to type. There was something unexpectedly freeing about it. Not bitter, not vindictive, just clear. I sent one single email afterward, one, to a CEO I'd met at a conference, someone who actually listened when people spoke. Attached my resume, wrote 2 lines about availability, and closed the laptop. The rain was still hammering at the windows, but inside, something in me had settled. They would try to launch the platform without me. They would try to access a system that required an administrator who no longer existed in their building. And in a day or two, maybe sooner, they would finally understand the cost of not asking the simplest question in the world. What are you in the middle of building? The email I sent that night was only 2 sentences long, but it carried the weight of 9 years of work, exhaustion, and unrealized ambition. I didn't pour my heart into it. I didn't explain what happened. I didn't defend myself. I simply stated that I was available immediately and brought nearly a decade of enterprise platform experience. Then I hit send and closed the laptop, expecting nothing until at least the following week. Instead, the reply came before sunrise. My phone buzzed at 6:42 a.m., the kind of hour when only emergencies or opportunities dare to intrude. Coffee today. That was all she wrote. Dana Whitlock, CEO of the competitor we'd spent years trying and failing to outrun. I agreed, showered, and left the apartment before I could overthink anything. The cafe she chose sat on a quiet corner downtown, the kind of place where people held serious conversations between bites of pastries that cost more than they should. She was already there when I arrived, tablet open, a calm presence in a room full of early morning tension. She motioned me over with a warmth I wasn't used to from executives. "Rough day yesterday?" she asked, not unkindly. I didn't bother pretending otherwise. There was no point. She'd read the industry gossip. People always heard when a CEO's son made a spectacle of firing someone. I told her the short version, not the humiliation, not the rain, not the hollow looks from coworkers, just the practical truth. I explained the project, the timeline, the authentication layer still awaiting final transfer. I didn't embellish. I didn't blame. I simply laid out what was. Her expression never changed, but her eyes sharpened with interest. "So let me get this straight," she said, leaning forward. "They fired the person holding the keys to the system they're about to launch?" I nodded once. She exhaled, slow and thoughtful, as if slotting a final puzzle piece into place. "And you're free?" "Completely." What she said next wasn't dramatic. It wasn't grand. It was simple, decisive, and more validating than anything I'd heard in years. "We want you." She slid the tablet toward me. A job offer filled the screen. Higher title, higher pay, 4 weeks vacation, a professional development fund, equity, and a start date of immediately. No delays, no committee approvals, no hoops, just recognition. Real, immediate recognition. Something tightened in my throat, not from emotion, but from the sudden, startling contrast between how I'd been treated yesterday and how she spoke to me now. "One condition," I said. "I don't want to be contacted to help my old company. No consulting, no troubleshooting, no quick questions. If they call, I'm unavailable." Dana smiled like she'd already expected that. "Samara, if they call, it's not your problem. And frankly, it's a problem they built themselves." I signed the offer right there, my name scrawled across the glass. For the first time since being marched out of my office, the air felt lighter. Not triumphant, just clean. A door had closed behind me with a violence I didn't deserve, but another had opened with a clarity they never saw coming. As I walked out of the cafe, sunlight broke through the clouds, catching on the pavement like the beginning of something new. They were probably already discovering the cracks. I didn't need to rush. The consequences were on their way, and I had somewhere better to be. By the time I walked into orientation at my new company the next morning, my old phone was already buzzing itself halfway across the desk. I ignored it. Whatever storm they were stepping into no longer belonged to me. Instead, I sat in a bright conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows, listening to a trainer walk through company values that actually sounded like they meant something. Respect, transparency, collaboration. Words that would have made me laugh 2 days earlier now felt strangely grounding. Every so often, the phone lit up again. Unknown numbers, office numbers, extensions of pi, recognized but had no intention of answering. I turned it face down and focused on filling out my onboarding paperwork. Around noon, while eating lunch with 2 engineers who seemed genuinely excited to have me there, a voicemail notification slid across the screen, then another, then 3 more in quick succession. Something was happening, something big, but I wasn't about to break the one boundary I'd set for myself the moment I signed that offer letter. I stayed exactly where I was, learning the layout of my new office, the rhythm of the new team, the expectations for the role I now held. It wasn't until later, much later, that I learned how quickly the panic spread after my firing. 3 hours. That's how long it took before someone finally admitted out loud that no one knew how to activate the platform. They had the interface, they had the modules, they had the infrastructure. But the final step, the one that turned the entire system from a pretty shell into something functional, was missing. Or rather, had been walked out of the building in a cardboard box. Elliot Crane, the IT director, had apparently been the first to say it directly in a meeting Jordan arrogantly led that morning. "The administrator credential hasn't been transferred," he said in a voice Sarah, now Marilyn, later told me was a shade too calm. "We don't have access to the core." Jordan had waved him off like swatting a mosquito. "So get access. That's your job." Elliot explained again. And again, and when it finally sank in that the system couldn't be forced open, overridden, or bypassed without risking catastrophic data corruption, the room reportedly shifted from confusion to dread. It was in that moment, according to Marilyn, that the CEO's expression changed for the first time. He looked at his son, not with disappointment, but with a slow, dawning horror. Because it wasn't just that Jordan had fired someone essential. It was that he had fired someone essential at the single worst possible moment without asking a single question, without understanding the implications, without checking whether the work was finished. And worse, he'd done it loudly, publicly, cruelly. By day 2, they'd tried everything. Elliot had pulled his entire team into a war room setup. They combed through documentation. They dug through commit histories, project notes, meeting transcripts, old architecture diagrams. They found every piece of the authentication framework except the one they needed. The administrator credential was missing because it wasn't written anywhere. They brought in outside consultants who charged triple their hourly rate for emergency turnaround work. The consultants left 8 hours later with nothing but a report that basically said, "This system is locked exactly as designed." And all the while, as panic spread through floors I once walked confidently for years, I was sitting in a quiet corner office at my new job, sipping good coffee and learning the roadmap for a platform they actually trusted me to build. The calls kept coming, urgent, desperate, increasing in number and decreasing in patience. But I never picked up, not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because when someone shows you exactly how little they think of you, you believe them. And you move forward. They were unraveling. I was beginning again. The consequences were separating us further with every hour that passed. Launch day arrived for them like a ceremony. For me, it was just Tuesday. I was in my new office at 7:30 a.m., reviewing competitor analysis and mapping out the early structure for the platform Dana wanted me to rebuild. Sunlight spilled across my desk, warm and steady, so different from the fluorescent chill I'd spent 9 years under. My old phone sat in the drawer beside me, turned off, out of sight, out of mind. At least until curiosity nudged me around 9 a.m., I powered it on. The screen lit up like a fire alarm. Voicemails, missed calls, messages from numbers I didn't recognize, and ones I knew far too well. Before I could tap anything, another call came in, then another, then another. I let them all slide to voicemail. Whatever had happened, the meltdown was in full swing. What I didn't yet know, but would later hear in vivid, painful detail, was how spectacularly their launch had collapsed. They'd hired a production crew, catered breakfast for executives and clients, set up a massive screen in the main conference room to show the system processing real orders in real time. Investors had flown in, the board was in attendance, and Jordan, poor, oblivious Jordan, was positioned right at the front like a prince presenting his inheritance. They started the demonstration. The interface loaded beautifully. Charts and dashboards lit up just the way we designed them. People nodded approvingly, cameras rolled, and then the sales lead clicked the button to access the first real data set. That's where everything stopped. The screen froze. A spinning icon replaced the dashboard. Then the message appeared. The message I'd written 6 months earlier for testing. Master authentication required. Please contact system administrator. A breathless stillness filled the room. Someone tried again. Same message, another button, same result, a third attempt, same unchanging polite refusal. Investors leaned forward. Board members exchanged looks. A client whispered, "Is this part of the demo?" Someone from engineering muttered, "No." Finally, a voice in the room asked the question that would haunt the company for months. Who is the system administrator? Silence stretched too long. Someone else finally answered, "Samara, she was fired last week." The reaction rippled across the room like a physical shock. The CEO shot out of his chair so fast, one of the board members flinched. He left the conference room without a word, heading straight for the executive hallway where Jordan was desperately trying to call me in his office, pacing, sweating, losing whatever confidence he'd worn like armor just days earlier. When his father walked in, the door didn't even have time to close before the shouting started. I wasn't there to hear it, but Marilyn later told me you could feel the vibration through the wall. "You fired the one person we could not afford to lose," the CEO snapped. "You humiliated her. You marched her out like trash, and now look where we are." Jordan tried to explain. He thought I was dragging the team down, thought the company needed younger energy, thought he was showing leadership. But intentions don't fix consequences. The demo had already failed in front of people who mattered. The launch was effectively dead. Engineers rushed to their stations, trying every override they could think of. Elliot's team attempted bypasses they knew wouldn't work. Consultants were called back in. Data was duplicated, restored, tested, overridden, recompiled. Nothing mattered. The system wasn't broken, it was incomplete, and the only person who knew how to complete it was gone. At 10:15 a.m., while I was sketching out a new authentication flow for my fresh start, Donna knocked on my door. "You okay?" she asked softly. I must have looked distracted because she added, "Your old company's platform was supposed to launch this morning, wasn't it?" "Was it?" I said, though we both knew better. She smiled knowingly. We've already received calls from 3 of their major clients asking about migration options. Not anger, not vengeance, just opportunity, handed over neatly by people who had underestimated the wrong woman. Meanwhile, back in that conference room across the city, with investors watching and executives unraveling, the truth finally settled over all of them. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I hadn't broken anything. I hadn't touched a line of their system since the day I was marched out in the rain. Their disaster wasn't my act. It was theirs. A direct consequence of a decision made by a young man desperate to appear powerful. And as they scrambled to salvage what they could, I sat in my quiet new office, the sunlight warm on my hands, already building something better. While they were scrambling through emergency meetings and investor damage control, my days were unfolding with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. By the end of my first week, I knew every member of my new team by name, knew their strengths, and more importantly, knew they actually cared about the work. There was no air of superiority, no jockeying for power, no dismissive glances the moment someone over 40 opened their mouth. Instead of being treated like someone taking up space, I was treated like someone who brought value into the room simply by walking in. Donna scheduled a working session on Monday morning to map the architecture for the new platform. It wasn't meant to replace my old company's system. It was meant to surpass it. We went feature by feature, not trying to copy anything I'd built before, but to rethink it from the ground up using everything I'd learned in 9 years of doing the impossible with half the resources I needed. When I finished presenting my design draft, the room went quiet in a way I wasn't used to. Not uncomfortable quiet, respectful quiet, the kind people give when they're absorbing something meaningful. "This is exactly what we've been missing," Dana said, tapping the screen, "and now we finally have someone who knows how to get us there." That sentence alone undid months of frustration I'd swallowed at my old job. Meanwhile, applications began landing on my desk. Engineers I'd never met, but whose resumes came with familiar histories and recognizable scars. People who had worked under rushed timelines, inconsistent leadership, and departments that never communicated. Several came from my old company. One message simply read, "Heard you're here. Are you hiring?" I was, and I brought them in one by one, building a team that understood both the stakes and the satisfaction of being respected. Clients began requesting meetings after learning I'd joined the company. Some asked if I would personally evaluate their systems. Others wanted confirmation that the platform I was designing would avoid the pitfalls they'd just witnessed elsewhere. They didn't say the name of my old employer, but they didn't have to. Everyone in the industry had heard. The story was spreading. The disastrous launch, the missing administrator, the humiliation of the CEO's son. People whispered about mismanagement and arrogance and the dangers of putting power in untested hands. My new platform plan, once just a sketch on a whiteboard, quickly grew into a fully funded initiative with a timeline, a dedicated team, and open support from the highest levels of leadership. We weren't just building software, we were building trust, something my old company had shattered in a single morning. By the end of the second week, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Momentum. Not frantic survival mode momentum, but purposeful, grounded movement toward a future I was shaping with my own hands. Their world was collapsing under the weight of one man's arrogance. Mine was expanding because someone finally recognized what I could do. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to watch them struggle. I simply needed to keep moving forward, and the farther I moved, the clearer it became that their downfall and my rise were happening on parallel tracks, heading in opposite directions, never to meet again. 3 weeks after my firing, when life had settled into its new rhythm, I finally met Marilyn for a drink after work. She walked into the bar with the look of someone who'd aged 10 years in 3 weeks, dropped her bag onto the seat, with a sigh, and said, "You would not believe the mess that place has become." I didn't ask. She didn't need prompting. She launched straight into it, detailing the chaos with the weary disbelief of someone still living in its aftermath. The launch fallout had been worse than anyone outside the building realized. Clients pulled contracts, investors demanded explanations, board members questioned leadership, and in the middle of it all, the CEO's son was unraveling publicly, shoulders hunched, Confidence shattered, stuck in a cubicle reviewing expense reports like an intern who'd overstayed the summer. "He keeps asking if you left anything behind," Marilyn said, swirling the ice in her glass. "Notes, drafts, anything with a hint of the administrator access." She gave me a pointed look. "You didn't." I shook my head, not out of spite, but because there had never been anything to leave. The work wasn't finished. It was still in my head, waiting for a proper handoff that would never come. "He still thinks it was sabotage," she added. "He tells people you planned it." The idea almost made me laugh. Planned? I hadn't planned anything. He had. He planned to make an example out of me. He planned to impress the board. He planned to establish dominance on his first day. I had simply lived with the consequences of his choices, and so had everyone else. "The CEO apologized, you know," Marilyn continued, softer now. "I heard the voicemail he left you. He meant every word." I nodded. I had saved it, not because I needed his apology, but because it was the only acknowledgement I was ever going to get of what happened, and because hearing him take responsibility made it easier to close the chapter fully. "Elliot quit," she went on. "Half the platform team followed. They're rebuilding the entire architecture from scratch. It'll take months, maybe more. And the consultants they hired? They still can't replicate what you built." She paused, long enough for me to understand what she wasn't saying. They'd had everything they needed when I was there. Then they threw it away. "I hope you don't feel guilty," she added. Guilt. That heavy, familiar weight tried to stir in my chest, but it couldn't get far. "I don't," I said simply, "because guilt is something you feel when you've done harm. I hadn't harmed anyone. I hadn't broken anything. I hadn't withheld anything. They made a decision rooted in ego and ignorance, and the fallout belonged to them. Mine was the decision to move on, and I had honored it." When Marilyn left that night, she hugged me tightly and said, "You're better off. We all know it." Walking home, I realized something important. It wasn't the apology, the chaos, or the poetic justice that mattered. It was the freedom, the quiet, the certainty that I was finally building something that wouldn't be destroyed by someone else's arrogance. Their world was still, burning. Mine had just begun to bloom. A month later, when Dana stopped by my office to tell me we'd landed 3 more clients, each one a former account of my old company, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and stillness. Not vengeance, not triumph. Just the quiet confirmation that the world has a way of balancing itself when people refuse to see the value standing right in front of them. That night, I sat in my apartment, the one I could finally afford without doing mental math, and reviewed the hiring plan for the next phase of our platform build. My team was doubling, opportunities were expanding, and for the first time in my career, I wasn't bracing for the moment someone would dismiss my experience because it didn't look exciting enough to them. Somewhere across the city, Jordan was still sitting in that back cubicle, probably telling himself it was all bad luck. People like him rarely understand the difference between misfortune and consequences. Misfortune happens to you. Consequences come from you. He thought firing me would prove his authority. Instead, it proved his inexperience. He thought he was removing an obstacle. Instead, he removed the only person holding the knowledge his entire launch depended on, and he thought I would crumble. Instead, I built something better. If you've ever been underestimated, pushed aside, or treated like you didn't matter, let this be your reminder. Someone's opinion of your worth doesn't determine your future. Your work does. Your resilience does. Your refusal to shrink does. Their collapse wasn't my revenge. My success was. I didn't realize how much strength I'd been carrying until the moment they tried to strip it away. Being walked out in the rain, treated like a problem instead of a person, should have broken me. Instead, it revealed something I hadn't fully seen in myself. Quiet power, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't demand attention, doesn't try to look important. The kind built from years of preparation, careful documentation, and showing up when no one else did. And the truth is, that quiet power only becomes visible to others when they lose it. The company thought I was replaceable. They thought my experience could be picked up by someone younger. They thought my work lived in a folder or a meeting note. They never understood that real expertise lives in patterns you've learned, mistakes you've fixed, and details you've kept straight long after everyone else went home. Losing my job didn't take that from me. It just pushed me somewhere it was finally valued. So here's what I tell people now. Don't underestimate the parts of your work no one sees. Don't downplay the habits that keep everything running. And don't let anyone convince you that being quiet means being small. My strength wasn't loud, but it was the backbone of an entire system. And when they dismissed me, they dismissed the structure holding them up. Their collapse wasn't my intention, but it was the result of forgetting that the most powerful people in a workplace are often the ones who say the least and know the most. How to get started today. Keep a simple record of your responsibilities and ongoing work. Build systems only you understand deeply, then document them clearly. Notice where your quiet strengths show up most. Protect your time and energy. Burnout hides your power. Remember that calm competence outlasts arrogance every time. What quiet strengths have you been overlooking in yourself?